Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here for our Baraza Friday, September 25th. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Susan Cooksey here with us today. She's the curator of African art at the Samuel P. Harn Museum of Art here at UF. A lot of us are familiar with the museum and the collection, and Dr. Cooksey's terrific work curating that collection and sharing it with us and our students and the wider community. We may not realize that the Harn holds one of the largest collections of African art in the Southeast. And I think much of that is due to the excellence, the interest, the knowledge of curators like Susan Cooksey. And we all have benefited so much from her care for that collection. She has curated many exhibits, written numerous catalogs, scholarly articles on works in the Harn collection, as well as many special collections and exhibitions that draw on works from around the world. These include Congo Across the Waters, which was a collaboration with the Royal Museum of Central Africa in Belgium, African Interweave, a textiles exhibition, A Sense of Place, an exhibit and catalog on African interiors, another exhibit and catalog on African beadwork, African healing and divination. So there's just a breadth of materials and regions and approaches to the study of African art that Dr. Cooksey has mastered and shared with us. She's also been very involved with the African Arts Journal, which is the leading journal within the discipline of African art. She's been at UF for many years. She did her undergrad degree here. Many of you might not realize that she has an MFA specializing in painting, and it doesn't surprise me that she brings a true artistic sensibility to her appreciation and understanding of African art objects. She earned her PhD at University of Iowa and then returned here to UF, where she's been for close to a couple of decades. Her most recent exhibit, and she's going to be sharing that exhibit with us today, is the Peace, Power, and Prestige Metal Arts in Africa, which is currently at the Harn Museum. It will travel to other museums around the country, and people should do their best to go and see it if they can before it closes the end of November. The Harn is open 4 days a week, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and they're being very careful about social distancing, and the exhibit is open for all to appreciate. That exhibit comes with an exquisite book, impeccably researched and written. Many of the articles are by Dr. Cooksey, by other scholars we know, by some students from UF, and it's just a beautiful work that covers so many corners of the continent in a very wide range of objects, including some objects from my own personal collection from Ghana. So I do appreciate the opportunity to share them with the public. We're going to be hearing about that exhibit today in Dr. Cooksey's talk, Agents of Change, Metal Arts and Artists in Sub-Saharan Africa. Before I turn things over to her, I just want to share a note of appreciation before her retirement at the end of this year. She has just done so much for the center. Whenever we needed someone to share the collection, meet with a group of students, of visitors, share her knowledge, provide advice. She's always been there to just provide top-notch information and insight and just a lot of great participation in the life of our center. So thank you so much, and we really do wish you all the best in this next phase. So take it away. We are looking forward to your talk today. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Brenda. That was very kind. And I wanted to say that the exhibition closes November 29th and I retire November 30th. So I think that's pretty good timing. But I do want to share the screen with you now, if that's okay. And this, let's go to slideshow. So as Brenda mentioned, our exhibition, and I'll just go ahead and click on this slide that shows you the installation, is up at the Harn in its beautiful rotunda, and this is the title wall. As you can see, there are 144 objects in there, I believe. They're selected from the Harn's collection and from some private collections. So please come and enjoy it before November 29th. And please contact me if you would like any more information about it or even a private tour. I can't do it all the time, but the Harn is a wonderful place to be right now. So thank you for that plug, Brenda. And the book is available. Here it is. It's a lovely book, as she said. Quite heavy, actually. And you can acquire it through the Harn. We are working on our online sales, etc., but the Amazon, you can get it on Amazon and through the University Press of Florida. So I've done all my sales pitch, and now I'd like to talk about metal arts in Africa. In the recent exhibition, I looked at the roles of metal arts in African societies, and we know that metal objects transformed African societies and had a far-reaching impact, stretching across the continent, the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. And today I'd like to consider some of the forces, the entities, and conditions that propelled these transformations. The social, political, economic, religious, cultural, art, and aesthetic realms, looking more closely at the agents who affected changes and their historical context. And of course, I'll be discussing artists, and I would like to talk about what we do know, what we can discern about their lives and artistic processes. And I will consider how metallurgists strove to create more aesthetically charged and expressive objects from the primary metals copper, iron, and gold to produce opulent jewelry and other personal adornments that indicated wealth, prestige, and social status. They also created powerful symbols of political authority by refashioning everyday tools and weaponry into vibrant regalia that forged the link between human and divine authority that persisted for centuries in many cases. Sculptures provided spiritual protection and assistance in problem solving and advancing the cause of justice and peace for individuals and their communities. Now, identifying the traits of metal artists is going to be a little bit tricky because obviously we don't know a lot about some of them going into the distant past and in not so distant past. So their identity eludes us in many respects. However, I would like to just tell you a few things about what I have learned in the course of this research. Now, I have to start out by saying in this exhibition of 140 some odd objects, we only have one firm attribution of an artist's identity. And we rarely, that being said, in museum collections, we rarely have attributions going back to the pre-colonial era and even the colonial and modern eras in any medium, much less metalwork. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It is being done brilliantly by a lot of curators and scholars, which is very heartening. And it's a way to humanize and decolonize our collection. So we've started working on that, and I hope that it continues in full force after I leave and the next curator takes that on. I'm sure they will. But there's some characteristics of metal artists that I'll talk about briefly. Metal artists, smelters, and smiths took lumps of ore and transformed them by fire, then skillfully shaped the metal, relying on knowledge passed down for generations, artistic intuition, and a playful and boundless imagination to create wondrous works. In some communities, they were celebrated and embraced. In others, they were reviled and marginalized. In many communities, they were ambiguous figures who were sometimes isolated in exclusive groups that were often endogamous. Males dominate metal making, which was thought to be dangerous for women, but women collected ore, made charcoal for smelting. They designed fine jewelry. They did design and they do design jewelry. And those married to smiths are masters of other media, including ceramics, basketry, and textiles, among others. Some smiths were thought to have arcane knowledge, and for smiths like the Western Sudanic blacksmiths, such as the Mande, this meant cosmic forces that empowered their art production, as well as knowledge of herbal medicines. And they were versed in the art of leather making, rain making, preparing graves, and performing various religious rites, among many, many other things that they did. In other communities, they quickly aligned themselves with local leaders, and I'm talking about all metal workers, or became the leaders themselves, even assuming the role as divine kings, as was the case with the legendary blacksmith kings of the medieval kingdoms of West Africa and those of West Central Africa. These celebrated blacksmiths were thought of as cultural heroes who civilized societies, and their legacy is still recognizable in the arts and cultural practices of many peoples, including the Mande, Congo, Cuba, and Luba peoples. The nature of metallurgy is that it requires both resources and a welcoming cooperative community to sustain a livelihood for the smiths, and many of them were itinerant by choice or by circumstance. When trees supplying charcoal for furnaces were slashed and burned, or ore beds were depleted, they moved on. If societies rejected their services or could not adequately support them, they found other amenable communities who appreciated their skill, knowledge, and talent, and the bounty and prestige that their creations brought. Certainly, some communities prospered at the expense of those who did not embrace new products and ideas of the metal artists. The changes wrought by metal artists could also threaten local cultural and social traditions, local markets and political systems, and therefore they were another cause for rejection of their services and their persons, their being. On the other hand, metalworkers lived at the behest of their patrons. Being exceptionally knowledgeable and skillful gave them leverage, but these attributes had the potential to subjugate them. Brass casters in northern Ghana, for example, served at the pleasure of the Ashanti rulers in the south, and in the Cameroon grass fields, the best casters from Tikar were taken to kingdoms in the south to work for the court. More sinister interactions occurred as the slave trade heated up and metalworkers became prized catches. Slavers caught and shackled them by the very weapons, manacles, and chains they had forged. Also ironic was that the tools, weapons, and restraining devices they made were critical to the transport and sustenance of other enslaved Africans as they were taken to plantations and other operations in the Americas. African metallurgists, primarily iron workers, were so discerning about the quality of metal and metal objects they produced. They were in great demand in the American colonies. During the American Revolution, for example, a Pennsylvania foundry owner demanded that they have African metal workers for its operations to make munitions to support the war, and won the case to have the price dropped for the purchase of the smiths. Now, metal is a medium that lends itself to innovation and renovation. That is, one can take it and change it subtly or radically by any number of processes. The preciousness and rarity of metals is a factor that make metal works venerable and seems to have invested it with deeper meaning over time. Many objects lost their meaning and were melted down to be reformed with new techniques and iconographies. But metal was valued intrinsically and extrinsically. extrinsically, and artists and their patrons added value and meaning to metal objects. So how can we talk about these objects, which are currencies from the Copper Belt region in southern Democratic Republic of Congo? The object on the left is called an HIH currency by archaeologists because of its interesting H shape, and the other one is known as an HXR currency, which is quite bigger. The one on the left dates from the 9th to the 13th century when it was in use, and the other dates from the 14th to the 17th century. So we have some quite old objects. They were used, they were made in the Copper Belt region, and they were mold made, with the larger one having these crisp raised edges, whereas the other has softer edges. The oldest one was widely circulated from the region around the Upemba Depression all the way to Great Zimbabwe, and it was used for trade, probably as a special currency, and apparently also became a sign of status and prestige, as many were placed in the richest graves in the 13th and 14th century on the chest of the deceased. And these are pure copper, they're nearly pure copper ingots. The large HXR cross ingots produced in the eastern Copper Belt and in northern Zimbabwe were used as special purpose currency and as prestige goods from the Copper Belt in southern Zimbabwe. Other copper cross-shaped currencies were used in later years as social currency and bride wealth exchanges, as in the case of the large cross of the Kuba called the Honda, which is used up until the 19th and early 20th century. And that you can see here on this large copper cross here, which is a puddle cast cross. And you see the variety of other crossettes, as they're called, small crosses, and other forms throughout the ages. Now, as with many of the metalworks, the cross ingots were cherished for their innate values of pure copper. But also, there seems to be something that was significant beyond that. Why the cross one was used and replicated for centuries, we don't really know. They traveled with the deceased to the other life, where they proclaimed his or her status to the spirit world. And was it the copper, the metal itself, and or its symbolic form that made it transcendent and gave it spiritual versus material value? Those are questions we can continue to ask. But pure copper was valued across the continent, and it was a favored metal for personal adornment, small tools, and implements as well. For many people, it was valued and admired much more than gold, and it was more accessible than gold to the non-elite. But elite people who had access to gold obviously treasured that a lot more. In some cultures, it was ascribed with not only symbolic associations, but with its own agency. I'm talking about copper. It had the power to bring the other world, the world of deities and spirits and ancestors, and channel their forces to empower humans. How did that happen, do you think? One hypothesis has been suggested with the caveat that they are specific only to certain societies, and this hypothesis connects copper's aesthetics with its symbolism. So 3 aesthetic qualities of copper: its gleaming surface, its color, and its sound when struck, as in a copper bell or a copper alloy bell, were not only thought to be beautiful and alluring, but conjured the presence of unseen forces of the world of ancestral spirits. Red, the color of blood, evoked nurture, birth, fertility, and loss of life, thus the entire life cycle. And therefore it was connected with the ancestors who were responsible for guiding human life and continued after death to inform and nurture them. The gleaming surface evoked the numinous presence of the ancestors, and the sound of copper bells was likened to the sound of spirit voices. Sculptures of cast or solid copper bells and ritual implements, or of copper, implements of copper grace altars where one can contact the ancestors and ask for their assistance in matters of fertility, birth, health, and well-being in life. Regalia items were adorned with copper to enhance the message that the powerful presence of ancestors would sanction the actions of the bearer, including the power over life and death. The copper was considered extremely important, and we'll see examples of how that worked. But I first want to look at another kind of currency, this magnificent Lokeli blade spear currency. And the object you're looking at on the left of the screen is about 6 feet high. It's a little bit, it's one of the largest one, and you can see in the photograph by Emile Torday from 1907 to 09, men holding these currency forms up, and some of them were maybe 3 feet tall, some about 4 feet, and so on. So they increased in value according to size. But they're called Leganda Doa, made by the Topoke or Lokele people, and they were common forms of currency, spear blade currency, but this is an extraordinarily large and graceful form, extremely thin, with a beautifully forged ridge, and you can see that on the left side of the blade. They were used to store wealth for families who could use them for different purposes, but mainly for bride wealth exchanges. Iron blades in various forms were used for such exchanges. Spear and hoe blades were created for trade and were adapted by local smiths into different shapes and fitted with plain or carved handles depending on their utilitarian or ritual and ceremonial use. And outrageously large examples of these hoe blade currencies are over 1 meter wide. And at the same time, agricultural implements such as knife and hoe blade currencies became associated with women's labor in the fields. Thus, bride wealth using such blades was symbolic of women's labor, which was a valuable asset to her husband. Now, the 3 ceremonial weapons that you're looking at here are cognac adze on the left, a teke axe in the center, and a bakwa karanji adze on the right. And these ornate axe blades are typical of West Central Africa and even beyond in other areas. Ornate axe blades and an anvil found in the early graves in the Upenda Depression inhabited by the Lubais people were signs of prestige and signified the importance of iron for the Luba thereafter. Recalling the royal and divine founders, the blacksmith kings, the Luba and other West Central African smiths forged blades for use as ceremonial regalia, adapting knives, axes, swords, and spears, and enhancing the blade shapes with flourishes, perforations, and incised patterns, as you see here on the right. And also carving the blades, as you see here, into figurated and other forms, graceful, very ostentatious forms in some cases, and adorning the blades, either the blades themselves or the handles, with copper and brass ornaments, using tacks, wire, and strips of copper and brass. So, and you can see in these that the blade extends from the mouth, and it's as if they are saying, you must pay attention to me, I am the authority figure here. Typically, they were wielded in investiture rites and other ceremonies, and the sharpness of the blade being a metaphor for the sharpness of the leader's words. The addition of the brass and copper gave the use of the iron, which is already considered a symbol of divine authority and power, even more power. So they doubled power by adding copper or copper alloy to these wonderfully made regalia items. Now I want to switch over to talk about iron in the Mande world. Mande smiths work among the Bamana Dogon and many other peoples of Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, and they inherited the legacy of the blacksmith kings dating back to the kingdom Soso in the 12th century who were reputed to have the powers to use iron to protect or harm, as they had the power to harness a universal force called Yama. The staff finial that you see on the left represents a powerful female, a soothsayer, as indicated by her large webbed hands and distinctive crocodile jaw headdress. The same headdress is seen on the male equestrian on the right, who's wielding a spear, who recalls the cavalries armed with iron weapons that swooped into West Africa to form the great medieval kingdoms. And both iron and crocodiles are powerful opponents of malevolent forces. So Yama can be harnessed in these objects to fight malevolent forces. The crocodile was an intercessor with the spirit world and the ally and protector of humans. Thus, the hat appears on hunters and those who seek protection from malevolent forces and warriors, for example. The smith would have made these sculptures more powerful as he shaped them. Making them beautiful made them a more effective object, and it imbued them with more life force or Yama. Such four objects were placed strategically to defend individuals, so they might have been placed on altars or sacred sites. And for communities, they might have been placed, say, on the edge of town, so when an approaching enemy came, they would be able to deflect the power of that approaching enemy. And that was particularly true of the equestrian staff figures. So this figure is freestanding, but some of them were mounted on staffs that were planted in the ground with their back to the enemy. Now, smithing in recent times has changed. Smelting has pretty much gone by the wayside. That complex and brilliant sort of process, it's very arduous and involves a lot of people. The colonial powers did their best to wipe out local blacksmithing enterprises, and they flooded the market with iron. Of course, Africans had a huge appetite for iron, so by the 20th century, a lot of scrap iron and pig iron was sent to Africa. It had been coming in for a long time, but that was the end of local smelters, and certainly by the late 20th century, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody doing smelting throughout Africa, but I'm sure Peter Schmidt and some other people can correct me about that. But smiths are still working and thriving. And on the left, you see two young Bamana smiths in central Mali. The picture probably goes back to the 1970s, but you can see that they were in a sort of traditional village smith forge, working away, learning the art of metal work. And in the right-hand side, you see Monsieur B. Bertha, a smith, a Sugun Nikura in Bamako, kind of a suburb of Bamako. And as I mentioned, the smith's work has changed, and most of their production is utilitarian rather than sacred or ceremonial, but they have changed to adapt to contemporary needs. So they produce everything from wheels for rickshaws to kitchen utensils and other objects from imported scrap metal using a variety of techniques. But Monsieur Bertha is a smith, as I said, who is a member of, he's a Bamana smith who's a member of an organization called Fantogo, meaning forge. And it is a coalition of immigrant smiths. And a lot of smiths have come from the Dogon area or elsewhere to urban centers where they can get work. And Fantogo, this association, is designed to maintain the highest social and spiritual functions of the lineages of blacksmiths and the esoteric and sacred knowledge of smiths. And as I said, many have migrated, and there are around 100 smithing families just in Segunikura. And I'm sorry, but I spelled it wrong on the slide. It should be Segunikura. So they continue, and there's hope that they will continue to protect this wonderful knowledge that they have for some time. Now I want to talk about iron in the context of Yoruba metalsmiths and what blacksmithing meant and who was involved with that. So what you see on the left is a staff that unfortunately it's been cropped and I didn't have a picture of the whole thing, but it has a slight curve on the bottom of this iron staff that you see holding up this brass figure who is also holding a staff with a curved end. And it is actually thought of as a poker that one would use in the forge. So poker is, or the furnace rather, it's the blacksmith's official symbol. So these very elaborate pokers were made to serve as an official sign of the blacksmith's shop. So he would proudly display that as a symbol of his workmanship. So it's kind of like his shingle that he would hang up to say, this is a great thing that I can do. And some of these are extremely complex sculptures. You can see that it's made of brass and iron. So it evokes not only the god of iron, the male god of iron, Ogun, but also the female deity associated with brass, Oshun. So there's a balance here of two different deities with two different interests. The cooling powers of Oshun, who's associated with the waters, and Ogun, who's associated with blacksmithing, who's associated with aggression and warfare, but also has another side and is a dualistic character, as you'll find out. So the staff that you see on the right is a ritual ceremonial staff, but it also looks like an axe, has this beautiful flared blade and a wonderful carved handle. This is an exquisite treasure of the Harn that we value very highly, and it is now on its way back, I think, from Paris, where it was on display at the Quai Branly Museum in a show called Striking Iron that originated at UCLA. And Striking Iron celebrates African ironwork and is a marvelous exhibition and has a wonderful book with it. And this was featured in both. But as you can see, it represents a figure who is holding what you may not be able to see right in the center here, two tiny vessels. They look like gourd medicine containers. If we're talking about an axe for Ogun, and this is from the Owo Yoruba area, why would he have two medicine vessels? Well, maybe he is conflated with Osayin, who is the god of healing. Osayin benefits from Ogun and his metal tools in harvesting botanicals that can be used as medicines. So the two are somewhat alive here in the sculpture so beautifully. So I just wanted to point out that's the other side of Ogun, that he works for all humans, and he was the designated deity to clear the path of the wilderness of the new world that humans were about to enter. So with his tools, he cleared the path. Therefore, he is the deity revered by farmers. He is a deity revered by anyone who uses tools for any purpose. So another example we have of an ironwork by Yoruba blacksmiths is this very, very, very interesting metal work here that has not only solid cast iron, but also wrought iron or forged iron, but these strips of iron here that are made from used farming implements. So the blades would have been made into strips and wrapped around this staff. And then here we see these, what look like almost seeds, suggesting fertility and planting, growth. Very appropriate for an agricultural deity staff. And they are made of brass. So again, the collusion of brass, of Oshun, and the iron of Ogun. And we have another deity represented here. If you look, there's a cross form here. Imagine this square shape in the center being a head, and here's a neck, shoulders, almost a figure, a very abstract figure appearing here, and a crossroads, the meeting point between humans in the spirit world is suggested here. And there, you can't see them, but in size here are two diamond shapes, or sort of oval shapes, that represent the eyes of Eshu, who is the messenger god who kind of brings the human world and the spirit world together. So all of this energy is encapsulated in this staff for Oko, Orisha Oko. And what you can't see are a lot of incised patterns and designs that suggest everything in the life cycle. So we insert this beautiful, very heavy staff inside this amazing beaded sheath because it's not supposed to touch the ground. And you can see it here, another beaded sheath installed in a shrine, which is attended by women priestesses. So here they are next to the staff, and it has its own sheath covering it, which is covered by designs that have almost every color in the rainbow. And those color designs are thought of not only as evoking the colors of the sparks as they fly off of the blacksmith's forge, but also they are considered to be, the patterns are considered to be praise poems for the Orisha. The flaps that you see here are amuletic devices that we see in a lot of Yoruba beadwork to seal in the power of the staff. Associating the staff with women, and again, is they supposedly were the first devotees of Oko, so they are here in attendance and they're highly respected for what they do. Now, you don't have to go to Africa to see the influence of Africa, and as I mentioned earlier, African smiths were in great demand here. Their presence is still felt, either if it's been adopted or passed on for centuries in the ironworks that we see in our cities. Consider Charleston, consider New Orleans, consider Savannah and some of the beautiful ironworks that you've seen there. And then look at this gate in our own Gainesville, Florida, on 10th Avenue. If you haven't seen it, it's the gate to a community garden called Dreamer's Garden. And it's an homage to Philip Simmons, who was the great American blacksmith from Charleston and was the grandfather of one of our own students named Ade Afunian, who lives in Charleston now. And this wonderful assemblage of objects of iron and other metals for Ogun was installed in on the property of a local carver, artist, and diviner, Onabamiere Ogunleye, also known as Baba Ona. Robin Poynter wrote an essay about this in my book, and he noted the changes to this wonderful assemblage over many years. And you can look at this and compare it to the same things in Nigeria or Republic of Benin, where Ogun or Gu is worshipped. So it's a wonderful way of reminding us of the power of Ogun and the power of metalworking here in the United States. Now, I have three objects here that come from southeastern Nigeria, and I have to say that southern Nigeria was the home of many, many talented metalsmiths going back to at least the 9th century and probably before. But what we have in our collection, and in the exhibition that I wanted to show you, is somewhat connected to the oldest traditions, but there is no clear connection. So I wanted to say that the copper alloy works associated with the Cross River metalworkers, that these two objects came from the Cross River, this stylized leopard skull and this figure with the striations, who may have come from further north in the Benue River confluence, have some resemblance to the ancient traditions of Ito Ukwu and Ife and Benin, but there is no clear connection, as I said. This wonderful bell came from a corpus of very fine metal objects that are identified as the lower Niger bronzes, and they date from the 14th to the 17th century. Most are bronze, but there are other copper alloys in the group, and they overlap in many ways with this bell shape in particular overlaps with many other bell shapes from the region, including most favorably those that were made for honoring Oshun. And you can see these herringbone patterns coming out of the nose, almost like serpentine forms that are seen also on the Oshun bells, and this knot-like form called, or this zigzagging form called an arrow knot, which are seen on some other bells. So those are two kinds of elements that you can see on these other bells in the lower Niger bronze corpus, but they are different in terms of each one. This one is a lot more naturalistic than some of the Oshun bells, and it has this very unique, well, very unique, it's redundant, it's a unique necklace which has this sort of bovine head and these beads. You can tell perhaps from this cracked area it's very thin cast metal, and it is pure bronze. We had it analyzed at the materials engineering lab here on campus. Dr. Juan Nino kindly agreed to let us scan it in his X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy device, and it was like putting it into a little MRI, and the scan said that indeed it was copper and tin, so it's an alloy that is true bronze, which means that it predates 1500 when so much brass, which is copper and zinc, flooded into West Africa. So we know this is a very old object, and we're very glad that we have that dating now, because in this region, the Smiths were itinerant. They went from place to place. So therefore, some styles overlap, and you might see some iconographic features that are the same, but you don't really know where they came from and who these Smiths were. But they were extremely talented, and we can see the sort of resemblance of the leopard skull here. This is from Igbo Ukwu. It's a staff finial from a tomb of what we presume to be a priest king, and it has lavish furnishings in it. This is another object with a striated face. Remember the striated form of the figure, also from Igbo Ukwu, and a very ornate bell from Igbo Ukwu, and these were all made of bronze. Now, the Nigerian metalworkers' art is beyond compare in many respects, and I think the legacy of the early masterworks of Igbo Ukwu and other traditions can be seen still, and we have a number of objects from Nigeria, including these a wonderful group of objects associated with the Ogboni or Ashugbo Association of the Yoruba. And on the left, you see a pair of figures called Idan Ogboni, which means they are Ogboni staffs. They're made of brass. The figures are brass, but the staffs that they're surmounted on are iron. A wonderful quadrangular bell with a face, very abstract face on it, for Ogboni, called an omo, and a fan pendant, which is quite large, made of brass, and is suspended with a chain around the neck. I'd like to talk about these a little bit, so I'm going to resort to reading again. The main role of Ogboni is to guide the community by the laws of Mother Earth, Ile, and ensure peace and harmony. They serve as judicial, political, and religious leaders. They are tantamount to an electoral college, and they preside over the selection of a new king and are empowered to counterbalance his power and even depose him if they find that he is unjust. The society is made up of men and women reflecting the bisexual nature of Mother Earth. Thus, the staffs and all the regalia of Ogboni and Oshugbo include male and female imagery. So, if you will note, on the Idan Ogboni, we see beards on each of these, and that distinguishes their common maturity and wisdom. And by the way, the Idan Ogboni are awarded to new members, and they wear them with the chain around their neck so that these two figures are resting on their chest. The metals are gender specific, as I mentioned, as iron considered male, controlled by the god Ogum, whereas brass is associated with the female deity Oshun. The fan-shaped pendant we see here has a face situated in the center and is used in appeals to Mother Earth and suggests the cooling of tempers and negotiations. And if you'll notice, all of these are bony objects, and all this, I forget how many we have in the exhibition, but quite a few, have faces on them. Anklets, bracelets, everything. They all have faces, and those faces are duplicated on many of them. Why the faces? Well, there's a Yoruba saying, may the world have a face. And according to Babatunde Lawal, who's written a brilliant essay in the book, this saying constitutes a prayer for peace, happiness, and prosperity, but it refers to the idea that if something has a face, it has a solution. And if these fans are sometimes touched to the head of a person who comes to Agboni Oshogbo seeking the blessings of Mother Earth or to solve one of their problems. So it has this kind of cooling, soothing effect on them, this healing effect. Now I want to turn now to talking about gold. This is the moment we've been waiting for with this beautiful kind of overload of visual stimuli in this image of the paramount chief and queen mother of Bekem state sitting in state at a Durbar in 2014. And you can see them in the center here, and they're surrounded by the sword bearers here, and the main sword bearer who is back here. He has this big feather headdress, and the spokesmen for the court, which are seated here. And they have gold leaf or solid gold or gold-plated ornaments. They have wonderful opulent kente cloth. So all of these things, and the umbrellas shading them, cooling them, are symbols of power, authority, and being steadfast. We have seen these kinds of symbols for 300 years since the Ashanti Kingdom was founded. So they are reminders that these power structures are still in place. All these art forms remind us of that. And they remind us also that gold was considered to symbolize the soul of the Ashanti Empire. Of course, gold was the economic backbone. It's what drew Europeans to their shores, into the forested regions where gold was mined. But we have to look beyond that right at the moment and think about this wonderful disc, which is gold, that was considered, it's called an Akra Kokanmu. It was the disc that was worn by the official sword bearer, the chief sword bearer who was here, and his name is Osei Boadu, and he's got this wonderful wrapped sword, which you can see the double lobe form here, which probably has gold on it. We have some like this in the exhibition, nothing quite this grand, but a double lobed sword. And this is in the exhibition in the Harn collection. It comes from the Harn collection. And the pattern that you see resembles cowrie shells in this sort of daisy configuration. That's my term, daisy, but just so you know what I'm talking about. And it is called tadi, or pool. So the soul washers discs, as they're called commonly, have many patterns, and they are worn in the ceremony in which the soul of the nation is purified. So it's a very sacred rite, and these had very important purposes. They're made from very thin sheets of gold that are pushed in from the back to form this repoussé pattern that you see here. Gold was used by both commoners and kings. Commoners were allowed to mine gold. They could only keep the gold dust. However, if they found any nuggets, they had to hand them over to the court for its treasury. So gold was stored in vessels, sometimes vessels that were made of brass. And this vessel here with this graceful curved shape derives from Mamluk dynasty Egyptian wares that were brought in the 15th century by the Mande traders, and they're inscribed with both Arabic inscriptions and semi-literate Arabic inscriptions or faux Arabic inscriptions, however you want to say it, and other motifs. And were used on shrines, sometimes for other things, but maybe offerings on shrines. But they may have also been used for storage, and certainly these cylindrical kuduro were used for storage of treasures, and treasures including gold dust. And they could have been buried with someone after they died. The owner could have buried it, had it buried with him. Often the motifs on the top are figural. This one has a kind of an inscrutable geometric motif and two small handles to lift up the lid. Sometimes they mimic imports from Europeans, but these go back probably to maybe the 16th century, and they're cast brass. This object you see here is a later version of a storage container, but the storage was for shea butter, which was a cosmetic rubbed to beautify and moisturize the skin, which one could then, when we're really dressing up, sprinkle with gold dust to beautify the body. But here, the very inventive smith has taken cast metal, metal sheeting, and made repoussé and inscribed it on the surface to form lots of motifs in various panels. And I think most of them have about 4 panels, so 4 different motifs, and no single, there are no 2 forward that are the same. This one has a very graceful, delicate serpent encircling the lid. It has a Sankofa bird, which is the bird that has its head turned backwards and looks to the past to ensure the welfare of the future. And it's a common Adinkra symbol that you will see throughout, with the proverbs attached to it that one sees on Forawa and throughout the Akan world. These Adinkra symbols keep popping up on textiles and sculpture and so forth, and gold weights, which we'll look at in a minute. This curious form here, I puzzled over this for a long time. I thought it must be some cosmic symbol, and then I looked at others that Doran Ross had displayed in some of his exhibitions and books, and I saw that the Smiths at this point, which we're talking about the 19th century now, some of them go back possibly as early as the 16th, 17th century also, but probably this one is from the late 19th, early 20th century. They were looking at machines and meters and things from the industrial world that had been imported. And this looks like some kind of fan or perhaps some kind of metering device. I don't really know, but there are rosette symbols that are old symbols that it may have related to in some way, but certainly it was a very dramatic kind of graphic image that caught the eye of the Smith. So they were innovating these all the time. Some of these were patterned, these shapes, these canisters were patterned after things that were imported, tobacco tins and other kinds of containers that came in. So this one is a very intriguing form, as you can see. They often have open work. This one has an open work that looks almost like a brazier. So that indicates that they may have been copying brazier forms. Now, gold weights were very important because they were used to weigh gold dust, which was used as a currency up until the time the colonial powers banned it in the 1920s. But up until then, every family had a set of gold weights, and they had a set of paraphernalia, scales, spoons, other things that were used to manipulate the gold dust. And here I have chosen a group of 4 from the exhibition, and they're 4 figurative weights, but there were anything you can imagine could become a gold weight. The earliest weights that came from, say, the late 15th century, or maybe a bit earlier, were geometric forms. Later, they became figurated or natural forms, or even things that were live cast. And we're talking about cire perdu, or lost wax method of casting, where you make a mold, you make a wax mold, you pour the metal in, it displaces the wax, and then you open it up and clean it, and you have this metal form. So here on the left, we have someone blowing a side-blown trumpet, with a human jawbone attached, and it refers to a proverb about if someone deserves a jawbone attached to a trumpet, then I'm mangling this, but the point is that if you slayed an enemy and it was an honor to have it put on a side-blown trumpet, and then the trumpet was blown when the chief approached to praise the chief and his warring exploits. So it's a sign, it's sort of grisly sign of aggression and warfare, but the more generalized meaning of the proverb is that anyone who deserves recognition will get recognition. So it's attached to the proverb. This little captive figure is a mystery. It could relate to an enemy who was captured and then maybe enslaved. It could relate to the idea of slavery and trade in slaves across the ocean. It could relate to the use of slaves in mining gold, because indeed they were used in mining gold, especially for royals, and even people who could afford to have a slave do their mining for them, a rich family or a rich company of miners. But, oops, go back again. This horseman that you see here, this equestrian figure, bears a rifle. And yes, the local smiths could make any of the weapons that came to them from Europe. They would duplicate them beautifully. So this weapon that you see here could have come from, or could have inspired, or been inspired by something a smith made or something that was imported. But nevertheless, a figure on horseback is a symbol of power, because the invading Mande came from the north in the 15th century on horseback. Horses weren't well known in Ghana before then, but they were used or taken over, I guess, by the rulers, the Akan rulers after that. So they became a sign of aggression and warfare. And the equestrian figure, as you saw in the Bamana sculpture, has persisted for centuries as a symbol of power and authority and aggression. Let's, I keep clicking back. And this last figure, the more complex figure of a chief, and you may not be able to see it, but he is holding up a staff, and there is a retainer that is holding a bottle for him, and another retainer in the back that is blowing a trumpet. So he's smoking a pipe. I'm sorry, this is a very large pipe. The more complex gold weights came about because of Ashanti aggression, according to Timothy Gerard, who said that they were becoming so wealthy and wanted to display their wealth, and other people who wanted to display their wealth wanted more and more complex and heavier gold weights with all kinds of figuration on them, all kinds of inventive ideas. So the Smiths were incredibly inventive and worked overtime to make these amazing, tiny, what I consider monumental miniature sculptures. Some of them are so powerful and so beautifully made, but they were highly skilled brass casters. The highly skilled brass casters still survive today, and there were guilds that formed all around the Ashanti capital in Kumasi, and the guilds for textile making in Bonwiri are still active. You can still visit them. They're still producing beautiful kente cloth. And if you go to Krofrom, you can see amazing metalwork being done, and particularly in the workshop of Kofi George Doki you see here. And he is making traditional kinds of regalia items for chiefs, but he's making them now out of brass and electroplating them with gold, because the chiefs can no longer afford pure gold ornaments for display. So here he is making the crossed crocodile motif emblem. Here is a display of work made by the Krofrom workshops for tourist consumption. So they have adapted. You can see Adinkra bottle openers here. You can see hooks with fish motif, anything you can imagine, overblown images from old gold weights, kuduo up here. These are heads on them. So they're mimicking older traditional vessels and other art forms, and also some new ones here, some little houses, which you see in many tourist shops. These look like buses with loads on top of them. So you can find anything if you want from these brass casters. You can commission them to make almost anything. And they're very prolific, and they're very inventive, and they keep moving with the times. I worked with a brass caster who knew how to make things for diviners in Burkina Faso, and here he is, Yersidis Lama. He came from a long-standing Jula family that had been there for generations in Bunana in southern Burkina Faso. Here he is making a pendant of a leopard, and here's a leopard pendant that's actually in the exhibition made by another smith, but here he is making a wax model of one. He knew how to make objects for diviners and healers all across this region. And if you were a person that came to him from a group that said, oh, I'm a diviner and I need a certain kind of necklace, he knew what the necklace was. He knew how to make it out of copper or brass. If you were from another region, he'd make that. What I found was that the monumental miniature idea also held true in objects for diviners, and they were thought of as amuletic devices. In the exhibition, I have several of these, but I wanted to show you some special ones. These are two figures, male and female figures, that would have been called tassier for the Seneca peoples that they relate to, for their diviners. They were called madebele, and they're intercessor figures that work in the spirit world for you. They communicate with spirits there and try to solve your problems. So then they communicate to the diviner. So they stand at the ready in the diviner's altar area. And usually they're made of wood. So it's very extraordinary to see metal ones. That must have been an extremely successful diviner that she could afford to get metalwork paired figures. So the pairing relates to the harmony of the universe, that all things have to be paired in order for there to be peace and harmony in your life and in the community. So they're very much similar to the idea that we saw in the Yoruba world of everything being bi-gendered. So here is a bracelet for a diviner, and this is a symbol of her spirit other. So she would wear this copper alloy bracelet on her wrist. This is a small turtle. It's actually only a couple inches long, but it's a turtle form that has persisted for a long time. This is probably one from the 19th or early 20th century, judging from the looks of it and the style of it. And turtles would have been given to someone or prescribed for someone whose spirit other came from the water world, because they describe three different worlds that we all have spirit others in. You either come from the water, the forest, or the mountain. So water friendly creatures such as turtles or even serpents sometimes would be from the water, and serpents, pythons were associated with mountains and forests as well. So there are many other beings that are associated with our spirit others. So I just wanted you to see some of these tiny but very powerful sculptures that you would either purchase or commission to wear on your person or to install in your home. And if you did everything the diviner said, of course, it would solve your problems. And you would have cure illnesses. You could be able to conceive children. You could solve a problem with your neighbor stealing your goat, or whatever it was, or make better grades in school, or anything that came across your path that you could solve with the help of these little brass sculptures. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is a very interesting ensemble of jewelry that we got, and we commissioned it from a designer in Dakar who is known as the Queen of Fashion, and her name is Umusi. She has an amazing career behind her of being a fashion designer. She's involved in film and theater, wardrobe design. If you've ever seen the movie Hyena, she designed the costumes for Hyena. And she is just multi-talented. She's had an internet business for a while. and was trying to allow people access to the internet who were illiterate, because she herself is illiterate. And she thought, well, this doesn't matter, you can still communicate. But her mind is always going, she's always thinking, making these amazing designs. And there was an exhibition at the Smithsonian that was curated by a woman named Amanda Maples. And Amanda Maples helped us procure and commission this from Umusi in the workshop. And you can see that it's a wonderful, heavy ensemble of silver that's dipped in gold. And this is a headpiece with these big lobes on it, and earrings, a big necklace, a bracelet, and a ring, all using a motif called the flower basket motif, which was really pioneered by Cartier and some of the very famous French jewelers, and they still make these out of many precious jewels in many different forms. If you Google it, you'll be dazzled by them. And here's a model wearing them. You can see that she is absolutely dressed up in this beautiful bazin garment, and she's got henna on her hands. She's dressed as if she were going to be married or going to some very important religious occasion, perhaps a child naming ceremony when one would really dress up. The idea of dressing up goes back to, well, first, before I get into that, I want to show you the workshop where Umusi is working with the metal workers. And here's Umusi right here. And here are the metal workers. And the only identification they gave me was Bobo and Les Frères. So it's Bobo and his brothers working in the shop in their car. And you can see the plan for our necklace here, and the silver parts here, and here on the table where he's wielding the torch, about to fuse some of the filigree or the fine wires or the granulated bits onto it. These techniques go back centuries, and they were probably, they were used for sure in the Senegal River Valley, which is a very rich, gold-rich area, as soon as the 14th century, and probably much sooner. But there are examples from the 10th and 11th century that came over from Egypt and Syria that are very, very similar in terms of techniques and forms that are seen in Senegal even to this day, and have been adapted for local use by wealthy elite women, but also by women entrepreneurs who are banding together, pooling their money, using a sort of revolving credit to purchase the wonderful clothing and jewelry that you saw our model wearing. And this goes back to a group of powerful women that they connect to in the memory of Senegal. These women are enshrined in the memory of Senegalese urbanites. And they were mainly women of Saint Louis who intermarried with Europeans, the French and Portuguese, who came there as traders in the 17th century, for example, who wanted gold, they wanted all kinds of goods, including slaves. So these women understood the languages. They spoke French, Portuguese, local languages, Wolof, and others. They knew the trade networks. They were entrepreneurs in their own rights. They even had their own gold mines. And yes, they had their own slaves to mine the gold. And the slaves would bring the gold back. They would have the gold made in workshops, similar workshops, opulent jewelry, very flashy jewelry. And they would dress in the most opulent fabrics that were imported from all over, wherever they could get them. So they had the means to be as fashionable as they possibly could. They really liked to parade and have balls and show these wonderful fashions off. And they were known to have these distinctive headdresses called sugarloaf. Umusi recreated the look of one of these women who were called signares, which means married woman in Portuguese, in her exhibition Good as Gold. And this is the gallery shot that she sent me of the installation at the North Carolina Museum where it's currently installed. And you see a signare with her opulent garment, holding a fan and the sugarloaf headdress. And there are others as well, and there are images around the wall of signares. kind of recreated by contemporary photographers, Fabrice Montiero, who is a Belgian Benin photographer. I think he's from Benin, but he migrated to Belgium. So he is showing kind of a hybridized contemporary traditional version of what he thinks a signori would look like. So this wonderful idea of harking to the past and having this concept of looking good and feeling good is called sansei. Sansei is an aesthetic. It's something that urban Senegalese women perform. And it's incredibly empowering because they know they're showing solidarity with other women, and their history, their past, their identities are somehow fused with this concept of sansei. So I want to close with that, and if you all have any questions, but I want to one more time encourage you to see the exhibition at the Harn. If you get to North Carolina, go see Good as Gold. It's wonderful. I'd like to go see it myself, and I hope I can get up there. But if you have any questions, I know we went over time, but I'm here as long as you want.
Thank you, Susan. You have a question from Ben Suarez.
Oh, Ben. Hi, Ben.
So, hi, Susan. Nice to see you online. And I really enjoyed the exhibit is great, and I hope lots of people get to see it. And I really wondered how you would present it today, and I think it was great how you gave us such an overview of the different objects. I wanted to know how you actually identified the objects and how, because it seems like such a vast, overwhelming subject to curate an exhibit on, and you did it very effectively. So tell us more about how long it took and how you identified the collections that you borrowed from. You know, I was pleased to see Brenda's objects when I was there in the museum, but there are lots of other very interesting objects. And then of course you commissioned that Umu sea piece, which is also very striking.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful question and wonderful praise. I appreciate that, Ben. The show took about 5 years from the time I met a collector who had a huge collection of metalwork up in New York, and the time we talked about it, and I said, well, you know, I worked with metal workers in Burkina Faso. I'm fascinated by metal, and I've always thought metal was underrepresented in our collection at the Harn, and you don't hear that much about it, but oddly enough, there are three or four major exhibitions and publications on metalwork that have come out. One, Caravans of Gold at Northwestern University, and the Striking Iron exhibition. This exhibition, Ray Silverman recently had an exhibition on the brass work I showed you from Ghana, from near Kumasi. And there are all kinds of things going around about metal right now. It's just in the air. But it was a very daunting task to choose the objects because I had so much to choose from our collection and this other collector who has so much. And the strength of the collection you will see, as you've seen in the exhibition, is the Nigerian material, and particularly Ogboning. I mean, what I'm showing you is just the tip of the iceberg of what they have. But this donor was so insistent that I show as much as possible. So it was really a battle trying to pare it down to something that was coherent, cohesive, and I could have some sort of thematic integrity. And I'm not sure I achieved that, but I frankly think I wish it was more focused. But I did want to showcase some dazzling objects and some intriguing objects. And there were so many from so many places. And I had to seek scholarly help and do a lot of research over the years. I pulled in Robin Pointer as much as possible, and friends and students and anyone I could think of that could help me, and of course did a lot of reading. But sometimes I had to contact people in Africa about things, and I had an African friend from Burkina write an essay in the book and talk to me about blacksmithing there. And it was just a wonderful experience. It was quite an adventure. And Rebecca Nagy was the director then, and she, of course, helped with a lot of it. So she critiqued my selections and with a gentle hand, I must say, but I'm glad she was there because I felt like I could not include certain things. And I look and say, well, why did I choose this now? You know, it's in the show, it's in the book, but there was something else I could have put in, but I think that happens to every curator. But hopefully the result of this will be more interest generated in metalwork and more things for the collection. So that was an impetus for doing the exhibition and including so much. But it was very hard to identify some things, particularly the West Central African things that are so, the societies are so complicated, and people like Costa Petrides is my go-to person. He wrote an essay in the book for certain things, so he helped a great deal. Babatunde Lawal was a wonderful person to consult. Brenda, said that Eugenia Herbert was her professor, and couldn't I contact her to get her to write for the book? And I did contact her, and she said, well, I'm on to other things, and no thank you. I thank you, but no thank you. I won't write for the book. But then she sent me a pile of books. It was really sweet of her. So thanks to Brenda, I had some ready references that weren't easy to come by, things that were somewhat obscure, but really excellent references and sources to go through. So it was pulling together a lot of people and ideas and things, and a very complicated, and I would say a process that I would never go through lightly again. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad it's up and we can see it. The show opened the day the day the museum closed, essentially, for COVID, and then it reopened in July, and I was so happy that it would be extended to November. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that question, Ben. Do we have another question or comment from the room? Okay, I see a question from Martha Davis. Go ahead, Martha.
I think she's muted.
Yep.
Okay, unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi.
Great. I'd like to hear more about that couple from whose collection so many of the pieces have been drawn.
The couple are John and Nicole Denton. They have been collecting since the 1960s, which is very early for an American collector. They used to go to the docks in New York City, and African dealers would come in with things back then that were quite wonderful things, and they would acquire them, and they've been acquiring ever since. John lived in Africa. He lived in Sierra Leone and in Nigeria for a while. And he just fell in love with Nigerian art. So he, particularly Yoruba metal art, and he says that in the catalog. There's a statement in the catalog from him, which I wouldn't typically put in, but so much of the work is from him. It seemed very appropriate that he have, a statement in there. So he's still collecting, and he's still trading out and collecting, and he's given to many museums across the country. And we are the first museum to actually have a large show of what he has. I mean, other people have shown one or two works. The K. Brown Lee show I mentioned, Striking Iron, has about 6 or 7 of his pieces in it. And they're some of the finest African ironworks I've ever seen. Just fascinating things. It took 10 years to put that show together, and lots of people working on it and lots of grant money. So it's an admirable project. It's definitely a landmark project. But it was a thrill to be able to have access to this amazing collection. And it was hard to not just make the entire show that collection, but that's not something I really wanted to do. I wanted it to show off some of the beautiful treasures we have from the Harn as well. and encourage people to think about metalwork more, and maybe other donors to step forward and say, yes, I have some metalwork you might want for our collection. So that's how it works. We try to leverage things by showing things, try to leverage getting things to the collection by showing things and inspiring people. And of course, doing the publications and everything else that we do.
Thanks, Susan. Do we have another comment or question? We have about 10 minutes left, so we could take a couple more. Okay, you've got a question from Agnes Leslie. Agnes, I think you need to unmute. There you go.
Agnes, are you there? Something's gone wrong.
Yep, she's showing unmuted, but we're not hearing her. So do we have another question while that gets sorted out?
Is she putting it in the chat, maybe? I can't even see the chat here.
There isn't one.
Oh, whoops. Okay. Well, Agnes, you just emailed me with your question or called me. Sorry, I can't hear
Her
you.
mic is not functioning because she's not muted. So
Oh, okay. That's
do we have another question or comment? Okay, I've got one from Nancy Hunt. Go ahead, Nancy. If you can unmute yourself. There you go.
I just wanted to say this was a marvelous talk, Susan, and we are going to miss you at the University of Florida and the Harn. And just as Brenda said at the beginning, you have been a very engaging presence, and especially for our students, but also those of us who think about African art. So we wish you good luck, and this was a terrific talk, and I look forward to get over for the exhibit, which I've not yet seen.
Well, thanks, Nancy. I hope you can come by and I can see you. And
Yeah, I'll come by. I'll let you know the day.
yeah, I would love to see you and talk to you about it. So thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to try to go back to Agnes Leslie now. Agnes, are you there? Sounds like the same problem. Not coming through. Not muted, but not coming through.
If only we could see her and then she could make signs and symbols and let us know what she's thinking, maybe.
Does anyone else have a question or comments for our last 5 or 6 minutes? Okay, I've got another one from Kofi Mustafa. Go ahead, Kofi.
I just want to say this was beautiful, and thank you, Susan. And my research is on ironworking in Asia, but this talk has given me a lot of ideas and some of the things that I've not even been thinking about and all that. So this was great, and Susan has also been very helpful to me in terms of, even when I came back from the field, some of the things that I needed, she sent me some resources. So we're gonna miss her. And for me as a grad student, I would like to send my gratitude and appreciation for her contribution to my work. So that's all I want to say.
Thanks, Kofi.
I didn't hear a lot of that, but I think you said some very nice things to me, and I'm going to say some nice things to you because you helped me identify some ironworks that I acquired from the Lobe area, and also some Hausa divination boards, which are fascinating, which I plan to show, and I plan to use some of the information you gave me. So stay tuned for an exhibition on text and image that I'm working on with Carol McCusker that's coming up in February, and it will be sprinkled with things from different collections, including the African collections. And those divination boards are amazing. The metalworks that I acquired with your help, and you interpreted some of them, I should have mentioned that you had helped in that respect, were not used in the exhibition, but we have some that are sort of similar. So I don't know if you saw it, saw those similar objects, but they're there. There's a beautiful Dogon kind of antelope serpent head thing that is just a marvelous little sculpture, and it's one of my favorite pieces. It's very small, and you might not notice it, but it's a very dynamic, interesting form that would have been an object for an ancestral altar. So please come see it if you haven't. And thanks for those comments. So,
All right, we have time for one last question. It's that time of Friday.
Yeah.
Anybody? Agnes, are you there? Still no mic from Agnes.
Well, maybe we should call it a day.
We'll get that sorted out. See if I have another one here from. Oh, I do. Robin Pointer. Go ahead, Robin, if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to commend Susan on all of her work and to say that we're really, really going to be missing her presence at the Harn Museum. And we hope that she will involve herself in the retired faculty group. So that she just gave a talk to them on Wednesday. But when I first came here in 1978, I think Susan was still a teenager who had taken courses with Jean Borgatti. And then I inherited her from Jean Borgatti. She had a one-year seminar with Royce Sieber, who came as our first eminent scholar in art history. Then she went to Iowa, where she studied with Chris Roy, Bill Dewey, Alan Roberts, Polly Neuter, and was an assistant to Vicki Rovine, who was then the curator for African at the Iowa Museum, and then came down here to finish up her dissertation and stayed. So we've been very fortunate to have her here for these 40-something years.
So I'm a homegrown person here, and Robin has been my mentor and guiding light for so long. I can't tell you what he has given to UF, and especially the Harn, and to me, and so many students. So the Mutual Admiration Society here. But Robin contributed greatly to this. He helped critique a lot of my selections as well. He wrote a chapter in the book. He also helped edit the intro essay, which was very hard to write because there was so much ground to cover. So he and Rebecca Navy were kind enough to cast an eye on that for me. But I want everybody here, I just want to, as long as I have your attention, I am leaving the museum. I do not want the museum to go for too long without a curator. We have too good of a thing going at this university. So I ask for your help and guidance whenever the museum needs it to fill in the gap between the time I leave and we get a curator. And I'm just hoping and praying that it won't be too long. But we need to keep that on a roll because it definitely is on a roll now. And as I leave, I just want to tell you that I'm also turning my attention to collecting. I just brought in, by the way, some amazing spears from Alvin Wolf, who was in the Ngombe region of Congo back in the 1950s. And they're gorgeous objects. But I'm also looking at some contemporary works, and those are coming into the museum before I leave, I hope. And I hope the next curator will get us on a trajectory to also strengthen the contemporary collection and exhibitions. So I'm sure that will happen because most curators today are doing that. But I think the Harn really needs that kind of support and deserve that kind of support, and the university deserves it too. So I really appreciate the fact that I've been in a key position, and I couldn't have done it without all of you and the support I've gotten all these years in so many ways. So thank you for that too. And I feel like this is a a very final speech I'm giving here, maybe a retirement speech, but I guess it is, because I'm not sure if I will be seeing you again virtually or in any other way. But I think the arts are so important in engaging people's attention and directing it toward Africa. I've always felt that way in my work, that that's what I wanted. I wanted them to come in the galleries and say, that is an amazing thing. I want to know more about it. Now I want to know more about the people who made it, and so on. So that's been my agenda all these years. I hope that I've helped in some way. But it's been a great journey, I must say. Very wonderful.
Thank you, Susan. And thanks to everyone who attended today.
And thanks to Todd and Brenda for organizing all this. So thank you. I guess I will
Pleasure.
sign off, and we'll hope that I can get in touch with Agnes at some point.
Thanks again for a great talk. And I'm sure we'll all see you. So it's not the final word at all.
I hope not.
Bye,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for being here.